the CEO of OpenAI, he had this he was, interviewed about the worst case scenario if this stuff goes badly wrong. And he had this line where he said, worst case scenario is lights out for humanity. And that was a statement that Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, the developers of ChatGPT and GPT-4, made about that kind of existential risk. Now, I don't think he's saying that about next year, but the real question is, if we build an incredibly powerful intelligence system before we figured out how to make it safe, I think we should have relatively low confidence it's going to go well for humanity.
Artificial intelligence has been a topic of political conversation for quite some time. I should know, I partly wrote a book about it. It's called Fully Automated Luxury Communism. Though I must say, when I wrote that book and when it was published, many people were skeptical about the rise of the robots and how technological change would disrupt the economic status quo. Sure, they would say, Aaron, this might be coming in the 2040s or 50s or 60s, or maybe when we're all dead in the 2100s, but this is not a problem for right now, here in the 2020s. Yet, with the development of ChatGPT over the last 12 months, people are finally starting to have that conversation. Maybe artificial intelligence is far more developed than we realize, and with exponential improvements, perhaps it's getting out of control. Ian Hogarth is a founder and investor in technology companies. He wrote a brilliant article in the FT Weekend magazine talking about all of these issues and how, in fact, we may need political regulation to catch up with technology. Ian, welcome to Downstream.
Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. We're going to talk about some really big issues which a lot of our audience may not be that acquainted with: artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc. Why do you have authority on these topics, and why should they listen to you over the next hour?
I'm not sure I have that much authority. I can tell you my background. So I studied machine learning at university. I did a master's, started off with making a robot, and then after that made computer vision systems. So that's systems where you basically teach a machine to see in some way, recognize patterns, visual patterns. And the system that I built was one that could replicate some of the job that a radiologist does when looking at cancer biopsy images. So I sort of started out with a very engineer's mindset thinking about this. I then built a software business as a founder and a CEO for a number of years. And then I've kind of been involved in this since then as really an investor and I guess an academic. So as an investor, invested in about 50 companies applying AI to different fields, including some of the larger companies in the field like Anthropic, which is the second most funded AI startup in the world, and Helsing, which is a leading AI defense company. And then outside of that, I've really been trying to, expand the level of public awareness of what is happening in AI, primarily by writing a report called the State of AI Report, which I've written for the last 5 years. It's one of the most widely read annual reports on everything happening in machine learning over the course of a year. So I've been sort of trying to just expand the kind of, the quality of public information out there for policymakers or for, citizens who are interested to find out more.
Well, that's quite an authority. I mean, I like the humility at the start, but I think you're going to know what you're talking about. And for people who aren't quite clear about your writing, I mean, I suppose a quick stop for them would be this recent article you wrote in the FT Weekend magazine. Can you just briefly go over some of the issues you discussed in it?
Yeah. So I wrote that article maybe a month ago now, and the core idea is that there are a small number of incredibly well-funded private companies, primarily in London and San Francisco, that are kind of locked into a race where they're all racing as fast as possible to build what they describe as AGI. And AGI is basically a kind of godlike AI system that is capable of doing almost anything a human can do and more. And I felt like that race is now getting quite out of control and we need to slow it down. And so I wrote that essay to really just try to, shine a light on some of the things that, I learn about as part of my work, but that are maybe not public domain. So, I spend time talking to the people running these organizations, and I just sort of could see that the level of concern behind closed doors had really ratcheted up, and it felt like there was a big disconnect between the kind of public discourse and what people were saying in private. So I wrote the essay really just to try to close that gap a little bit.
That's so interesting. So we're talking really about a machine which is capable of augmenting its own intelligence, and very quickly you get a super intelligence, so to speak, an intelligence that we can't really fathom as human beings. You said that the fears and the concerns around that had ratcheted up. Over what time frame are we talking here?
So I suppose maybe it's worth zooming out and just talking about progress in the field in general. So if you sort of look at AI systems over the last decade, they've quite predictably gotten bigger. And so what we've done is every year we've been kind of increasing the amount of computing resources we give the largest AI models. And we've also been giving those systems more data to train on. And so that's been actually a very consistent exponential curve that's been running now for over a decade. And there've really been a couple of big kind of moments in time. The first was the founding of DeepMind, which really just brought a huge amount of ambition and energy to this challenge of like making these even bigger and more powerful systems. And the second, I would say, was OpenAI, which introduced a competitor to DeepMind that suddenly meant there was a race. And those organizations have been racing against each other now for, best part of their entire founding history. And if you look at that, we've gone from kind of, feeding these systems, some tens of thousands, or millions of images to feeding these systems most of the internet. And we've increased the amount of computing resource we give these kind of most powerful AI models by a factor of 100 million in just a decade. And so there's been this very, very continuous progress in the field. But as with any exponential, it's really only when you get to the steep bit of the curve, you start feeling it. And I think the last couple of years are kind of basically this, where the curve has just suddenly felt a lot steeper and things have been changing weekly or daily rather than yearly.
Wow, that is really extraordinary. So the word exponential, for people who aren't necessarily familiar with it, my goodness, virtually everybody is in 2023, but this was broadly integrated within discussions around computer science by Gordon Moore with Moore's law, and this idea that, broadly speaking, computational power there's a bunch of ways of sort of discussing it, but the same amount of power would basically halve in cost every 18 months to 2 years. And that has happened for a long time. It's kind of decelerating, but it's happened for a very long time. You're saying with AI, there's a bunch of variables. So it's not just the computational power, it's also the data that it's feeding on. And the two of these is important, right?
Correct. And so, for your listeners, an exponential, thinking about it simply is, for example, a system that doubles every year. Right. And so if you play that out over a number of years, you get a very steep curve because some property of the system is allowing it to kind of grow in that way. And the classic we saw was with COVID. But we as humans, I think, are just really poor at thinking about exponentials. They're not intuitive to us. And so we saw it with COVID. It's kind of January, people start to pay a bit of attention. February, things get more serious. March, some people really start to get, and then we're suddenly locked down. And that's kind of the nature, I think, of a system where you're having a doubling effect over some period of time. And that's what's been happening in AI for a decade. Is just we're now at the kind of February 2020 moment in AI where things are just going super, super quickly.
That's such a powerful analogy. Obviously, you can't go into the nature of private conversations you've had with people, but when people are putting a date on it, what are they saying with regards to an AGI then? And like you say, it's hard to predict by virtue of exponential growth, but are they saying in the 2020s, next year? I mean, what's the broad time frame here?
Well, so the first thing I'd say is that the people leading these companies have been thinking about this problem for a long time. Some of them have been kind of, a good example would be Shane Legg. So someone I admire greatly. He's a brilliant computer scientist. He runs DeepMind's AI alignment efforts, which we'll probably talk about in a bit, what that is as an area. But Shane, he did his PhD on sort of a computational basis for machine superintelligence, has made many sort of quite sophisticated predictions over the years around what it would exactly take in terms of the amount of computing resource and the amount of data before you would actually get a superintelligent machine that was kind of an artificial general intelligence. And so the people in this field have been thinking about it a long time. And I pay the most attention to the people who have been consistently making good predictions to me behind closed doors about what will happen. And the thing that I've noticed is it used to be the case that people would say stuff like, it's possible we might get an AGI, a super intelligent machine, in the next 30 years or the next 20 years. But everyone, I think, thought the idea of kind of something happening next year was kind of ridiculous. And now I think if you ask people, let's say, for example, there was a select committee and the various leaders of these labs, the technical leaders, were asked under oath, what's their probability that we get a superintelligence next year? It's not going to be 0%. Whereas I think it would have been before. Whereas now it might be, 5%. And so you have this kind of shift where I think everybody is starting to just sort of say, actually, we might be closer than we realized. We should start taking it seriously, the possibility that we might be very close.
So if a private enterprise develops an AGI, an artificial general intelligence, what happens next, do you think?
I have no idea. I think that the AI alignment community would basically say, most likely outcome is we're all dead. The CEO of OpenAI, he had this he was, interviewed about the worst case scenario if this stuff goes badly wrong. And he had this line where he said, worst case scenario is lights out for humanity. And that was a statement that Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, the developers of ChatGPT and GPT-4, made about that kind of existential risk. Now, I don't think he's saying that about next year. But the real question is, if we build an incredibly powerful intelligence system before we figured out how to make it safe, I think we should have relatively low confidence it's going to go well for humanity. And there's a kind of very, I guess, sophisticated intellectual argument about how to think about that. And that's the sort of thing that someone like Eliezer Yudikowsky would write about, where he'll talk through the sort of exact mechanisms by which a system that's much more intelligent than humans treats us badly, primarily by accident. But I think actually the kind of common sense way of thinking about it makes more sense, which just says, humans have kind of changed the environment on Earth very significantly as a result of our intelligence relative to other species, and that's had significant consequences for some species and for the biosphere in general. And I think we should sort of just common sense tells you that something similar might happen if we invent something more intelligent than us.
Wouldn't the counter argument be, I suppose, that we've learned that over time we are dependent on the biosphere for our own systems, political, social, economic, to sustain it? I suppose, is there not an optimistic account of an AGI? And I think obviously there's a great deal of thought put behind being skeptical about this stuff, and I'm also skeptical. But is there not also a world where you have an AGI which is in some way benevolent, capable of very long-term planning, capable of awesome problem solving on a scale that we can't really comprehend?
Yeah, and just to be really clear, I think that is, that is the happy path we're now on. I think there's basically three paths. We have a moratorium that just completely shuts this down. And that could be like, some of the other moratoria we've had around, genetic engineering, for example, eugenics. There could be another path where we develop this kind of hastily and not thoughtfully and kind of wipe ourselves out in the process. And there's this third path, which is the one I think we should really all be oriented on, which is we build systems that massively expand the amount of kind of wisdom in the universe, and we cure diseases that can't be cured today. We have enormous technological abundance. And so there certainly is an approach where we build AGI and it goes incredibly well for us as a species. The question is just, are we on track to do that or not, the way we're doing it today, with a small number of private companies racing to do it as quickly as possible?
So with regards to ChatGPT-4, which was released in March by OpenAI, which is aligned with Microsoft, how big a jump was that from ChatGPT-3, which was obviously the previous version?
So ChatGPT, when it came out, was arguably a user interface on top of a very powerful language model that already existed. And so you already had these amazing language models that OpenAI had trained, and Anthropic and Google had trained to do very powerful things. And what OpenAI did with ChatGPT is they basically created a way to interact with it that suddenly opened it up to a lot more people. And so in many ways, it wasn't a sort of research technological breakthrough. It was actually a user interface breakthrough, and said, like, here's a way to use this that suddenly feels a lot more organic and natural to an end user, a consumer playing around with GPT. The thing they released after that, which was called GPT-4, was a significant update, because the ChatGPT was based on I think they were calling it GPT 3.5. And that was a big jump in the underlying model. So for example, GPT 3.5, when you sort of, tried to get it to do the bar exam, scored in the bottom 10% of results, whereas GPT-4 scored in the top 10% of results. So in a single generation of models, you had this massive leap in capabilities where it went from basically not really being able to be a lawyer to being able to be a lawyer. And so GPT-4 was a massive step forward for language models in general, and one of the most impressive technological artifacts humanity's ever created.
And what was the basis of that jump from 3.5 to 4? Was it purely because there was more data being fed, or there's been a sudden boost in computational power, or?
So it's a great question, and we don't really know. So OpenAI hasn't really explained to us what data they trained it on, the amount of computing resources they used for it, any algorithmic breakthroughs they made. They have kind of gone from being very open AI, kind of being very open with their research, to being much more closed with their research. And they have done it, I believe, for good reason, which is they sort of don't want to accelerate things any more than they have to by suddenly make it more possible to replicate this and kind of cause a huge amount of proliferation of this technology.
This is so interesting. So could it be possible then that OpenAI are further down the road to AGI than we really discuss, we really talk about, but the incentives aren't really there to be quite public about it, right? The incentives are there to actually be quite private and discreet, and to not really convey how close we are to a really transformational technology.
Yeah, the incentives are really challenging. So I'll actually give you a quite a concrete example that I think brings the race to life. So I'm one of the first investors in this company, Anthropic. And Anthropic was founded by a group of people who left OpenAI and set up a new AI startup. And it was the people who did it, founded it, were the people who led the research on GPT-2 and then GPT-3, so the precursors to these large language models. So they really are the key people from OpenAI who did a lot of the large language model sort of early work. And their new company is very much oriented around a greater emphasis on safety. So they have something like 50% of their headcount in 2021 was dedicated to alignment research and safety, which is higher than any of the other labs like DeepMind or OpenAI. And they had a product like ChatGPT about 6 months prior to OpenAI releasing ChatGPT. And if they'd released it, it would have suddenly put Anthropic on the map in a big way. It would have been they would have attracted so much more capital, more attention. And they held it back because they felt like it would just accelerate this race in a counterproductive way. And so there's a really, if you think about the incentives, it's working against them as a capitalist entity to just hold back stuff, to release less, to create less hype. It's quite challenging. And so recently they just actually made an announcement, maybe 2 weeks ago, where they expanded the context window for the largest language models to 100,000 tokens. And just to explain what that means, it's basically the size of the document that you can feed into a language model and have it work with for you. And so it massively changes what you can do. You can feed like a huge legal document or a massive code base into a GPT-4-like model and get a much more sophisticated response as a result of that. So it's a huge technological breakthrough. It lit kind of, the AI research community and sort of startup community on fire when they did it. And that ultimately attracted more attention to them, probably more capital over time. And so there's these perverse incentives where if you're a startup, you're kind of incentivized to get as much capital and attention as possible so you can go faster. But actually, if everyone does that, then we kind of burn the time we have to make this stuff safe. So it's a very challenging coordination problem where the incentives encourage racing rather than careful, slowed down coordination.
I'm very happy you said that. There's a great quote from Geoffrey Hinton, who recently resigned from Google. And he said in an event, "I think Google was very responsible to begin with." This is DeepMind. But once OpenAI had built similar things using money from Microsoft and Microsoft decided to put it out there, then Google didn't have much choice. If you're going to live in a capitalist system, you can't stop Google competing with Microsoft. So it almost sounds to me like one of the most powerful things about the market system, competition, which can lead to incredible efficiencies, has upside as well as downside. But particularly with regards to AI, this sounds almost like you couldn't build a worse system to potentially accelerate development while also not really addressing things which could go very badly wrong.
Yeah, I think that's It's very challenging because there are areas of AI research where I think actually capitalist competition is extremely good. So for example, there's 10 startups and they're all competing to make AI systems that can take in cancer biopsy images, analyze them really well, and improve the lives of patients, right? I'm not worried about that having a negative consequence on the world. And I think actually the price signals, the competition will be really good, and it'll ultimately give us all, cheaper healthcare, more innovation in the market. So the area of, I guess, narrow AI, where AI is just doing a single task, quite specified, and without these existential considerations, I think this kind of capitalist competition can be great. The problem is if we're applying the same logic to the part of the problem where we're trying to build something smarter than us, that's basically a new species. And that, I think, the kind of capitalist market dynamic is not helpful. And I think that, what's great is that the leaders of these organizations, I think in their own ways, they all kind of have done important things to acknowledge this. So, Demis, the CEO of DeepMind, is someone I really admire. He's really oriented a lot of DeepMind's efforts towards expanding the scientific commons, things like AlphaFold, which they release for free, and they've really expanded the amount of, that's not a very sort of capitalist maneuver to basically produce this massive breakthrough and then kind of give it away. But I think it hints at how he thinks the economic gains from this should be distributed. Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, he's talked about how he wanted to have the government fund OpenAI early on. So he didn't want to raise money from private investors. Just didn't get the support from the government to do that. He and his team have explicitly said that if the race becomes too dangerous in their charter, they've said, we will merge and assist another player to change the coordination dynamics for the better. And Anthropic have got a very, very, very thoughtful set of statements they've made about how they want to ultimately be much more cautious as we get closer to this kind of godlike AI. So I think we have actually leadership that is trying hard to do this. It just doesn't really work within the current economic system. And so, for example, I fought a antitrust case against Ticketmaster in the United States as part of the startup that I built, Songkick. And so, I'm very supportive of the kind of, the work that Lena Khan or the CMA have been doing to try to sort of decrease concentration in certain markets. But I think in this case, actually sort of antitrust is actually quite harmful because it almost it makes it harder to coordinate. There's less of a safe harbor. And so I think the main thing we need to do is really view these as quite different regimes. There's this kind of narrow AI regime, and there's this trying to build a God regime. And that bit needs a different regulatory approach to that bit.
There's a quote from Marx. It's in the Communist Manifesto. I was reading this the other day.
That's why I come on this channel, just to hear about Marx.
This is Ian, this is terrifying. Now, bear in mind, he wrote this 170 years ago. Marx wrote how capitalist society had, quote, conjured up such gigantic means of production and exchange that it was akin to a sorcerer, quote, no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. I mean, wow. That sounds like capitalist competition, creating something completely beyond motivation and intentionality, and over which it has very little oversight. Now, of course, he's talking about, steam power and mills in Manchester and Brussels and Frankfurt in the mid-19th century. But if anything, those words sound more appropriate for AGI in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think that one way to sort of frame the capital and kind of labor, the sort of relative power of those two groups is just looking at the size of some of these organizations. So, OpenAI is I think privately valued at $30 billion US now. Significantly changing the world. Hundreds of millions of people now using their products. And I think at the time they released ChatGPT, it was probably a few hundred people in terms of the size of the organization and the labor that's directly benefiting from kind of the work that's being done there. And I think that, again, the leaders of these companies are actually thinking hard about this. So Sam Altman, a couple of things I admire that he's done. The first is he was running a very large UBI study in Oakland. And so he was, that was, maybe 5-10 years ago, he was thinking hard about this question of how do you, if you do have further and further returns to capital, what do you do about kind of that not that not just massively increasing inequality. And, he's done this thing called WorldCoin, which is kind of a much more extreme version of that, which is a machine that scans your retina, produces a unique ID for you that would then let you be part of a global UBI scheme. And so,
wow.
And so there are, these kind of people are thinking about these kind of the way in which this may fundamentally disrupt some of the ways in the social contract we currently have that allows capitalism to sort of just continue as it does.
But I suppose the concern is you can't be dependent rather on benevolence and the foresight of certain individuals. There was a great quote a couple of years ago from Mark Cuban, and he was saying, "I wouldn't teach my kid to be an accountant." We now know that it was probably quite a good move because that's one of the industries which is very much prone to automation with machine learning. I'd rather they learn philosophy because it will give them insights that are harder to automate, so to speak. And I thought that was interesting. Now, alongside that, he said the world's first trillionaire will be the person who can master widespread commercial applications of AI. And that's the prize on offer, isn't it? I mean, that's the prize on offer. So today we talk about Amazon, which is a $1 trillion company, or used to be, borderline $1 trillion company, Amazon, Microsoft, those kinds of big players. But the truth is, the commercial entity which masters an AGI, and we don't all die, will put all those guys in the dust, won't they? So there are massive incentives for people to pursue this technology without the kinds of caution and intelligence and thoughtfulness that you've talked about with regards to somebody like Sam Altman.
Yeah, and I think what's challenging in some ways is we've entered a new phase of this race. So if you look at the leaders of these organizations, the ones who are kind of really at the forefront of the race, whether it's Demis or Sam or Dario at Anthropic, I would say that most of them are kind of not particularly motivated by money at this point. They're doing this for some other reason. Sam, recently announced that he actually has no equity in OpenAI, so doesn't stand to benefit economically from, he won't be the world's first trillionaire, let's put it that way. And so I think that they've been motivated by other things. And I would say mostly they've been sort of motivated by being the people to do it, to make this thing come alive, and the consequences of that. It's kind of a world historic transition that they want to be a big part of. Is my hypothesis. But there are now a lot of other people who've kind of suddenly woken up and just seen dollar bills.
Yeah.
And those people are just piling on money. They haven't really thought about it. They don't have the same sort of reverence that people like Demis have got for how we should be approaching this moment. And they're actually accelerating the race, but without that same, intrinsic motivation for the thing they're trying to do, and much more of a kind of, much more of a desire just to make money.
So for people out there who are perhaps skeptical of what I'm saying here about a trillionaire, if you told a 14, 15-year-old Ian or a 14, 15-year-old Aaron, we're about the same age, that one day there'll be somebody worth $250 billion US, $200 billion US, like Jeff Bezos, we would have thought that's outlandish. Yet he's the guy who starts Amazon, and that's the company which benefits from network effects, ubiquitous mobile internet, and basically building the everything store of e-commerce. And I suppose the question is, could you feasibly see a company like Amazon, which is applying AI to a bunch of industries, which lay off hundreds of thousands of people, just like Amazon have basically shut down hundreds of thousands of local businesses, and that's the outcome we get? Do you think that's a plausible outcome?
I think it is. I think that I think it is possible, and I think the reason for it is that you first of all have a much more globalized economy where things can spread really quickly across borders in a way they couldn't, especially digital products. Secondly, you have a lot of these technological products build on top of prior networks. So, for example, ChatGPT is the fastest growing product in kind of ever on the internet, but that's partly because we've got Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Google and all the ways that information disseminates and spreads faster than it did before. And finally, I think we're starting to tackle some of these incredibly large markets. Like, what SpaceX is doing is basically tackling, global internet provision through Starlink, right? And so this is a very big thing. It's not like digging up the street and smashing in loads of fiber. It's something where, the same satellites can basically provide internet access to wherever you are in the world without that same degree of physical disruption. And so I do think it's possible. I think a good thought experiment for the kind of company that might be an example of this is the first company to really build incredibly good domestic robots. Right. So, I've got a 4-year-old. When I'm doing chores around the house, I always sort of say to him, one day maybe there's going to be a robot doing this. Because, we didn't used to have dishwashers. We didn't used to have washing machines. We didn't used to have tumble dryers. And now we have all those things. We take them for granted. They're in most homes in the world. What would it be like if we had a robot in our house that just did all the chores that we currently do as kind of around everything else we're doing in our lives? But also that robot could be your plumber when things break, your electrician, your handy person, go to the shops for you. So when you think about kind of that sort of disruption, could it be a $10 trillion company where the person founding it is a trillionaire? Like quite possibly in my view.
A quick sort of move away from machine learning software to the kind of robot that you're talking about. How far away do you think that is, by the way, as a sort of household appliance that, middle class people in the UK or US would be able to buy?
Well, so I think it really is fundamentally the same curve we're talking about with AI. So robots basically are machine learning. They're just embodied machine learning where it has a physical presence it's using as well. And I've invested in lots of robotics businesses over the years, and it's amazing how rapidly they're progressing. We don't actually see the number of robots that we're using because they're mostly industrial settings. They're like industrial cleaning robots or industrial manufacturing robots or agricultural robots. And so it's happening. And I think that we will start in the next few years to see robots in much more consumer settings, really starting with the rollout of self-driving cars. And so I think we will see humanoid robots that significantly enhance our lives in a domestic setting within the next decade.
Next decade?
And a lot of that will be knock-on effects from the work we're doing in making these powerful AI systems. So to bring this back to large language models and the sort of things that DeepMind and OpenAI are working on, there was a paper called the Tool Former paper that came out earlier this year, and it essentially shows that large language models are actually quite good at using tools, which is quite counterintuitive. But to break it down, you take an incredibly large computer, you feed it an enormous amount of text and imagery, and basically get it to get really good at predicting what it's going to see. If you take that same sort of blob of intelligence that's just become smart in some important way, and you give it access to a tool, it is actually quite good at using a tool, whether it's a digital tool or a physical tool. And so large language models actually will have a knock-on effect on real world robotics. They're not sort of separate industries at all. They're very, very related.
I like it. And how far are we from machines basically being able to do anything that a human does? So in my mind, I think sort of 25 to 30 years where we have software, hardware, which can basically do 95% of the jobs that humans do. At the moment, the big obstacle to that obviously is the fine motor coordination, dexterity that things like cleaning or construction kind of relies upon. So it's easier to automate legal services or accountancy than it is, like you say, plumbing. Great example. How far are we from being able to solve the problem of the fine motor coordination?
So I guess we don't really know, right? That kind of goes back to this question of how far away are we from AGI? How far away are we from like sort of super intelligent systems? Yeah. No one knows. All I will say is people have they put more probability on it happening soon rather than later. So Jeffrey Hinton, who resigned from Google recently, he said, I used to think this was, I'm not paraphrasing here, but he said something like, I used to think this was decades away. And now I think it's not inconceivable it happens in the next 5 years. And he's the godfather of machine learning, the researcher that really kicked off this whole field of large neural networks, and really one of the most important people in the field over the last few decades. And so we don't know, but I think we now need to sort of start to prepare as if we might be closer than people have realized. And the public certainly has realized.
Yeah. I mean, this is a big challenge to our economic system, right? So I wrote a book about this called Fully Automated Luxury Communism. Yeah. And the point is, if you get increasingly affordable technology, which can do anything that a human can do, whether it's with regards to abstract problem solving or physical capabilities like building a house or cleaning a house or cooking a meal, what that does is clearly depress the price of labor to zero. That's what's going to happen. That's a neoclassical understanding of how supply and demand would work with the cost of labor, of human labor. And yet, if you say that to a lot of people, including politicians, including quote unquote smart people in legacy media, in the policy world, they think you're crazy. And it's interesting for me seeing the reception of my book. FT, oh, this is interesting, very provocative, New York Times and so on. But then in some other places, I won't name the papers, but they were just sort of like, this is ridiculous. They were sort of mocking it. Where do you think this asymmetry comes from, where some people take these ideas very seriously and then others just completely disregard them? Is it a lack of information? Do you think it comes from a place of fear? Because realistically, if this is correct, we're going to have to shake things really up a lot, aren't we?
I think it's a great question. I guess I've got two hypotheses. The first goes back to the thing we were talking about with exponential change. It's just so hard to think intuitively about exponential progress. And so, COVID is sort of fresh in our minds. And I remember in sort of January, I was planning a trip to China with a friend, and actually our trip took us through Wuhan. And he's an expert in kind of biology in various ways. And I spent a bunch of time in China when I was younger studying Mandarin. And so we were talking about this trip and we were talking about COVID, and we sort of started to see the little inklings that COVID was going to potentially go pandemic. And I remember both of us were starting to prepare and get really worried ahead of a lot of the sort of mainstream news. But at the same time, we're both like, well, maybe it'll be done by the time that our trip comes around, right? And it's just a perfect example of like, we thought we were being clever, but actually we seriously still did not really have a good intuition for actually what happens when exponentials really take off. And I think that there's a bit of that where if you're a politician that's just dealing with, day-to-day issues, and you're then confronted with an exponential change, be it, what we're doing with climate change or a pandemic or an accelerating technology like AI, you just don't really have an intuitive way to navigate that. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is just exponentials require, I think, a certain kind of radical thinking. It's sort of like what I think the UK government did really brilliantly with Kate Bingham and the vaccine task force. I think it was a great example of kind of just incredibly bold, proactive leadership on a serious thing. Let's get ahead of it. Let's build that capacity early. Let's throw everything at it and prepare as best as possible because we know this exponential is coming. And that kind of political action and leadership is just, I think, like quite hard to do. And I think.
Why is it hard to do? Is it because politicians don't like doing it, or because it's just objectively hard to execute?
I think it's radical, basically. And I think it's not business as usual. It's first principles thinking. You maybe have to take more risk. And there just haven't been that many examples of political leaders who've kind of acted like that over the last couple of decades in response to technological change. And I remember in 2018, I wrote this essay, AI Nationalism, that really talked about this fundamental challenge that was coming down the pipe with AI. And I remember meeting with kind of MPs from Labour, MPs from Conservatives, laying out these ideas, and almost everyone just looked at me like I was completely crazy, because I was saying things like, next time we have a company like DeepMind, we shouldn't let it be acquired because it's too critical to the future of the UK. And then 3 or 4 years later, I saw similar politicians basically saying, oh yeah, now we have to be serious about blocking acquisitions of some, strategically important UK technology companies. And so I think it's just also discomfort with really radical ideas. I think there's much more of a comfort in politics with incrementalism. And that's why often big change happens when you have a crisis.
We'll come back to the politics in a moment. I want to ask you an almost existential question. A super intelligent artificial general intelligence, would it be conscious?
I don't know. I think that I was actually talking about this with someone who specializes in quantum computing yesterday, and their view is actually that like consciousness is a kind of quantum mechanical property, a property of quantum physics, and therefore it will not be possible to get consciousness on a classical computer. I don't know if that's true or not, but like their claim was basically we will sort of need quantum computers to actually have conscious AIs. I don't know.
What's the argument behind that, by the way? So where does that come from?
It comes from quite a I guess an esoteric argument about exactly how we interrelate with the metaverse, which I'm not enough of an expert on any of those topics to really opine. But the way I think about it is consciousness and intelligence are probably kind of somewhat orthogonal. You don't necessarily get one with the other. And I think it may have been it may be an artifact of biological life, which is inherently quantum, rather than necessarily sort of classical computing.
So we still could fabricate something close to consciousness, but it would just require quantum.
Maybe, or maybe it's not possible. We just don't. Consciousness is something, as far as I can tell, we don't really understand at all. So I think it'd be quite difficult to project how to think about consciousness when it comes to machines. Like, if I'm understanding it correctly, when you get when you have an operation, you go under anesthetic. The drugs you're being given essentially just switch off your consciousness. And we don't really understand like why and how that works. And so it's quite hard before we really understand consciousness to really make any claims about how AIs will be conscious. I think but I think we should probably start from the basis that they might not be conscious, but they might still be incredibly intelligent and capable of planning in ways that are threatening to humanity.
So we could have an AGI which is an existential threat to humanity without it being sentient.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. And it could be trying to maximize its own utility. It could be trying to maximize its own interests without really being aware of itself as an entity.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Thinking about it kind of like the Sorcerer's Apprentice is probably the kind of like a really mainstream example of kind of something where you give it some sort of goal, and the optimization of that goal ultimately leads to something that is not what you wanted. And so that's what the field of alignment is about. It's basically about how do you align those goals with our goals as a species.
What does this mean to the average person? So we're talking about AI, partly abstract, partly real world. So we're talking about, the potential of trillionaires. We're talking about consciousness. We're talking about politicians asleep at the wheel. But what does it mean to somebody out there who's watching, median income, homeowner, mortgage, owner-occupier? If there is an artificial general intelligence that's created, say, in the next 5 to 10 years, how will that impact their lives over the next, say, 25 to 30 years?
So again, with exponentials, saying anything about 20 years is really hard.
Let's say it's developed. That's the exponential part, and then let's say there's almost like a cap on AGI. Like it's not really developed after that for regulatory reasons or whatever, political reasons. I'm trying to really ask, what are the implications for just everyday people, rather than us talking about, like you say, some breakthrough which is akin to the printing press. The average person in 16th century Europe doesn't really care about the printing press, but then the Reformation happens, and that is a big deal.
Mm-hmm. So I think that synthetic media is a really, really big deal. And I think there is extremely low popular support for it. So, as an example, you can take the sort of generative AI systems, the systems that are capable of generating images or text, and you can use them for harmful purposes. So I'll give you a few examples. The first is you can take a snippet of someone speaking, and you can then, effectively synthetically clone their voice. And that is now being used by people to do kind of fake kidnappings, where you get a snippet of a child's voice and you basically create a phone call from them calling their parents saying, "Mum, I've been kidnapped. If you don't do this, then I'm going to, something horrible is going to be done to me." And that happened in, I think, Texas about two months ago. And so that's kind of happening. Another thing that's happening is around synthetic child sexual abuse material. And so the systems you can use to create a kind of funny image of the Pope in a puffer jacket, you can also use to create, horrible deep-faked porn, including horrible deep-faked child sexual abuse material. And that is currently happening. People are using these systems to do that, particularly the kind of open source ones. And the knock-on effect is then you've got the police are suddenly faced with, is this an image of a child that's actually being harmed or a fake image, and having to sort of shard their resources between kind of basically fake crimes and real crimes. And so there's a huge number of malicious uses that will bubble up from this very powerful technology where you can clone someone's likeness, someone's image, someone's voice. So I think of that as being like the real structural problem that we're going to encounter. And I think that I was talking to someone the other day who's been doing focus groups around this. And they were just telling me basically the public at large thinks deepfakes should be made illegal already. So there's a kind of, I think a lot of stuff bubbling under the surface that when it breaks through is going to really have actually quite a populist response to it, because it seems like something the government should be getting a grip of.
And do you think they will? Is there any sort of, you're in this game, is there any evidence that they will?
I think they will actually, yeah. I think it's just, it passes a kind of common sense test of that is not a good thing that should be happening. So I think there'll be a genuine motivation to make deep fakes without someone's permission illegal. And I think lots of politicians will want to do that. But I think the mechanism for doing that, when you've got significant proliferation of these capabilities into open source, is a bit trickier, right? Because the technology is kind of out of the box. And so figuring out how to get it back in, like with the dark web, for example, is just challenging. But I think there'll be broad political support for doing that.
You say the common sense thing, but I mean, if you said to somebody 40 years ago that children will be able to access high-speed broadband pornography, be able to stream stuff, I mean, I think most people would say that obviously should be banned. Yeah, that's the world we live in.
Mm-hmm. I think we've lived through a strange time. I think that I think about social media a lot and how it's sort of remarkable that we basically left this enormous industry that was so transformational to everyday life, to children, to politics, to the general discourse, to basically self-regulate. And I think there was actually that was well motivated by a desire not to kind of throttle something with regulation and kind of too much, too early. I think I can see the logic of things like Section 320, I think it's called, which is kind of the sort of the mechanism whereby a lot of social media companies have kind of been able to just self-regulate. But it feels like I think with the benefit of hindsight, it would have been better for regulators to catch up faster and to sort of be a bit more assertive about defining, a smarter way forward. And I think Biden talked about, for example, modifying Section 320 recently, and there's been some discussion about this. But I think with AI, I think then the lawmakers need to move faster, because back then, these fledgling startups like YouTube, they had certain sort of, it's kind of innovation was valuable and needed to be sort of encouraged. But this is a different ballgame where you've got $20 billion already invested in just a handful of companies. You've got, Microsoft aggressively deploying this as fast as they possibly can. You've got companies like Facebook open sourcing incredibly powerful models and putting them out there for anyone to sort of expand and modify. And so I think we're kind of in like the same scenario. It's just now this is not about small startups and fledgling industries. This is about an incredibly powerful tech industry that is just prefers self-regulation to anything else.
Do you think social media was a mistake? Because obviously you're involved in the sort of the technological side of things and how, the technological sort of underpinning of global social media, 4G, 5G, mobile internet, high-res screens, all these things. And one outgrowth of that was social media. And Ben Bratton has a really interesting read on this. So he says, we built a global real-time communications and computational network, including the kind of exosphere of our planet, which is now caked with satellites. We've built all of this infrastructure so that we can sell ad space and be permanently distracted. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. And I wonder, we might have something like AI or even an AGI, if it's not, deadly, and we would just get more of the same, perhaps.
So my day job is I'm an investor, and I invest through a fund called Plural. And, it's a European fund focused on accelerating missions that we consider to be of great societal importance, by funding them as startups. One of the companies I work with is a company called Unitary AI. It's one I'm very proud to be kind of working on. It's a startup that uses AI to understand content and thereby to offer a scalable approach to content moderation and content safety across the internet, content security. So, for example, their AI can detect some sort of content that should be illegal or some kind of content that is, causing significant harms and flag it to the platform that's hosting it. And so they're in many ways kind of like a antibiotic to this kind of the way in which some of the sort of wild west of content dissemination through social media has played out. So I think there is a kind of capitalist response coming, but it's hard and it's much easier to make a new social network than it is to make an AI company that's trying to actually solve this problem of kind of how do you scalably tackle the challenges of content. To your question of kind of, if you could kind of go back in time and stop social media from happening, I wouldn't have done that personally. I think it's delivered enormous benefits. I think there is something amazing about so much connectivity, democratization of media production. I mean, part of the reason I'm sitting here is because I learned about you through Twitter, and I follow your thinking and I find it interesting. And so I think there is something really miraculous about how connected we are now. I just think the problem is we just never really had governments keep up. And I think it's really the nature of like sort of laissez-faire neoliberal thinking having just permeated government over a number of decades, where really bold, ambitious projects where the government is a kind of, a real partner to the private sector and actually drives technological change and thinks about regulation in a bold way that embraces exponentials has just been missing.
So you think that's neoliberalism? Because we do live in this really strange moment, right, of like extraordinary technological possibility, like extraordinary, profound, liquid biopsies that can detect early onset cancer, mapping the human genome, just high res scans of the human brain, just, year on year improving exponentially. And yet we have politicians who say, sorry, we can't address the housing crisis. Sorry, we can't give you affordable healthcare or free healthcare. There's a weird disconnect there. It seems almost like the better the technology gets, the more the possibilities, the opportunities, the less capable the state is in addressing those challenges. So you pin that on neoliberalism. Well,
I think that particular problem you describe, like, it's hard to really know where it started. There's a kind of an investor I really respect called Matt Clifford, and he has a kind of a thesis on this, which basically says if you look throughout history, there was always a kind of part of society that attracted the most talent. And his argument is basically right now that's the technology industry. And so a lot of talent has kind of gone out of government or out of the public sector into technology, because the opportunity to change things quickly, make money, be the first trillionaire, whatever motivates you, right? And so there could be a hollowing out of sort of the capacity of the state to respond. That's one way of thinking about it. I think of it as being a little bit more ideological. So for me, I think we've just not really had political leadership that sort of said, we're going to transform this country in a way that really embraces all of this and is kind of, keeps pace with technological change. And I think you've had examples of that. If you look at Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, obviously lots to discuss about Singapore and their politics, but it's very interesting the way that he basically kind of was a founder almost of a country that went from third world to first world in 30 years. And some of the things he did were just very, very bold, ambitious things that ultimately he took a lot of risks and it delivered for the country and for the citizens. And so I think we've lacked that level of boldness. And the reason I sort of cite neoliberalism and laissez-faire economics is because I remember when I was talking to people about that AI nationalism, it was amazing to me that I would be meeting with conservative politicians and they'd be telling me about British Leyland as the reason why you can't nationalize DeepMind.
Crazy.
And it's just like, what is going on? This is like, it's like decades later, and who really cares about some failed car company at this point?
Also, you have Taiwan, which I think Taiwan produces like 1/6 of global microprocessors, 90% of the ultra high-end ones. The ultra high-end ones, which China can't create at the moment. And it's kind of, that's the whole point of this set of sanctions and trade embargoes that the US has put on them. That is entirely because of state-led innovation by the Taiwanese government. It's a country of 25 million people? And in the world where Taiwan is making 1/6 of the world microprocessors, we have British politicians saying, sorry, we can't do that because of this thing that happened in 1975 or whatever. Crazy.
Yeah. And I think it's obviously there are some people really trying, but I think the system as a whole is very trapped in an old ideology that sort of wants to be quite hands off rather than hands on. And, I work with Mariana Mazzucato at her institute at UCL. And when I first came across her book, The Entrepreneurial State, it just blew me away because if you've been a founder for most of your kind of working life like I have, it really described, but you really care about the future of the UK, the future of Europe. It really described a different mode of politics, which is this very entrepreneurial kind of founder approach, which says, right, like, the state is going to take a point of view, it's going to have a vision, it's going to pick missions that really matter, it's going to invest very ambitiously to make things happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. And I'll give you an example of something that, like, right now for me is very inspiring. So within nuclear fusion, you've got a number of different concepts for how to put fusion on the grid. And we've made enormous progress in fusion over the last few decades, and we're now actually, I think, within touching sight of it happening. And the dominant approach that's really taken us closer to, fusion on the grid is a technology called magnetic confinement fusion. You have very powerful magnets that confine essentially a sun on Earth, and you use that to basically produce a sun on Earth and extract energy. And the dominant mode of doing magnetic confinement fusion is something called the tokamak. And the tokamak was a device that's, there's probably $100 billion been invested in tokamaks globally over the last 50 years. And the German government actually took a different point of view, and they said, there is this other device which has a lot of attractive things about it that actually, are very hard to do, but we might now have enough computing power to do it. And they've been quietly investing, large amounts of money, but still quite small for fusion, into making this happen. And over the last 20 or so years, they've taken this alternative fusion reactor design all the way up to the point where we might actually be able to build a power plant, and it's called the Stellarator. And the German government has done that kind of almost single-handedly. The most advanced stellarator in the world is in North Germany, and it's light years ahead of any other stellarator. And that's the sort of thing that just gives me real goosebumps when I think about what the state can do when it really wants to shape markets. If the UK said, right, we're going to take a point of view, fusion's going to happen in the next 20 years. We want to have this country running on fusion in a material way. We want that to be a massive industry for this country. We're going to have this incredibly ambitious kind of investment mandate behind that. I think that's the sort of politics that excites me and makes me feel like we would have a politics that matches exponential change rather than just kind of runs behind it, trying to play catch up.
How popular is that kind of stuff in your world? So you mentioned Mariana Mazzucato. I suppose, she proselytizes a kind of social democracy with an interventionist state, like you say, with like an emphasis on entrepreneurialism as well. So it's quite a unique blend, although I really find it's a 21st century variant of 20th century social democracy, kind of updated for the network society. Are those ideas more popular than one might imagine amongst these kinds of circles, because tech people are generally open to new ideas, or are you something of an outlier in terms of enjoying Mariana's work?
I don't really know if I'm an outlier amongst founders. I think that founders are quite specific people, and that they're drawn towards taking risks. They often want to try to make the world better by building some product that they think the world needs. And I think a lot of them are quite radical in their bones, quite risk-taking, and I think they're drawn to interesting ways of thinking about politics often. I would say investors, and I'm kind of technically my day job as an investor, tend to be a lot more focused on turning money into money than actually really directing markets.
So a little while back, you mentioned quantum computing and the multiverse. And I know that's not the topic of this conversation, and I'm sure you have a great deal of knowledge about it, but you'll be very humble and say, I'm not the right person to speak to. But this is really intriguing, and I think our audience would love to hear more about it. What's this relationship between quantum computing and the inference that it perhaps gives us a glimpse at the possibility of a multiverse, multiple universes?
I think I probably will try to stick to what I know something about within quantum computing. So I chair a company called Phasecraft, which is a company founded by a number of UK professors. One of the professors that founded it is the sort of co-chair of the most important conference this year in quantum computing. So they are some of the kind of global leaders in this field. And what they're doing is developing software to run on quantum computers. And so as a result of sort of supporting those founders over the last kind of 3.5 years, I've kind of had a bit of a window into what's happening in quantum computing, and it really is quite amazing. So you've got these machines, probably the two kind of most impressive machines in the world. One is built by Google down in LA, and the other bit is built in China. And these machines take sort of, they use superconducting materials trapped in these kind of crazy cages to basically run computing operations that really allow for a much wider range of possibilities than digital computers, which are more sort of deterministic. And this
is because a digital computer has a 0 or 1 binary system, and quantum isn't constrained by that.
Well, yeah, it sort of it remains in superposition. So it's neither 1 or 0 until finally you kind of collapse the superposition. So what that allows you to do is to simulate on a computer things in the real world that are quantum. Because we know the real world is quantum, right? That's been established for over a long time. And yet when we're interfacing with quantum systems, for example, material science or biology, we still use classical computers to simulate them. And so we're sort of trying to use something deterministic to simulate something quantum. And so what's really exciting for me about quantum computing is that you may have a tool that lets us simulate aspects of nature that we have historically not been able to simulate. And so, for example, we can suddenly design incredible new materials that the engineers can use to make things we've not been able to make until now. Or we can simulate biology in a way that we currently can't today. And as a result, design amazing new drugs. And so I think that the way I think about quantum computers is they are a class of computer that allows us to explore and understand the universe in a way that classical computers don't. And that just feels like it's kind of like the invention of a microscope or something. It's like a really important new tool that gives us visibility into a realm that we currently don't really have computing resources that are appropriate for.
You have all these great analogies. I love this. So the idea of a quantum computer is like a microscope. And of course, prior to the microscope, people didn't really understand bacteria, germs, the majority of organisms on the face of the earth because they weren't visible to the human eye. You're saying something similar could be possible with quantum computing.
Yeah, and I think it's really about simulation. Yeah. That's the thing that I guess I've got personally really excited about is, you've got some incredible classes of materials that we know are quantum materials, right? The way that superconducting materials, for example, we know are quantum. And superconductors are amazing, in that they are, from a climate perspective, an energy perspective, they're like the material because you have no heat loss to resistance. So you could transmit energy across the UK without losing any. You have new energy storage opportunities. Fusion reactors, the type I talked about, require very powerful superconducting magnets to work. MRI machines require them. So they're kind of this magical class of materials called quantum materials. And because they are quantum materials, there's only so much we can really understand them by applying classical computing techniques to them, whereas a quantum computer would let you simulate them in a completely different way. And as a result, we might be able to discover new materials that we don't have access to today.
Before we started this interview, I asked you if you would consider moving to the States. That's kind of a cliche thing, but, people generally make their fortune over in the US when it comes to technology businesses. You said no, or you weren't really inclined to. So why do you want to stay here in the UK?
I mean, I think the UK's given me kind of, I think I'm quite patriotic. I feel very appreciative of what I've been given in terms of the privilege of growing up somewhere with universal healthcare, with great education, with, freedom of speech, the rule of law. Like there's lots of aspects of our society I'm very proud of, proud to be kind of, proud of, and I believe are really important to endure. And as we were talking also earlier, we should recognize these things as fragile. Iran was a democracy once and is not now. And so I feel a duty to give back to the UK, give back to Europe, and very specifically the sort of investment fund that my partners and I have set up. It's we're all former founders, right? That's the first thing about us. And the second thing is we've set it up to try and have GDP level impact on Europe. And so the idea is to help build some companies using our kind of scar tissue as founders to help another generation of founders who are like us to build companies that can end up being bigger than we've seen in Europe up until now. So I think of Skype, and I think Skype could have been Facebook. I see DeepMind, and I think DeepMind could have been Google or OpenAI. Or I look at Arm, and I think Arm could have been NVIDIA. And so we've got these companies where we never really got them to be what they could have been, their full potential to be these like transformational European technology companies. And so our mission as a fund is to try to produce a few of these companies that can change whole industries for the better. And by doing so, have impacts on European GDP, but also put Europe at the table when it comes to describing what's happening in an important new era of technology. So if we're going to put fusion on the grid in the next, in the 2030s, say, And Germany has been the state with the most kind of entrepreneurialism to invest in accelerators well ahead of everyone else in the world. It would be a travesty if the diffusion company that turns that into a startup isn't in Europe, in my opinion. And so I do feel just very embedded in European values. I mean, I lived in China, I lived in America. I a lot of admiration for both those societies in different ways. But I guess I'm kind of pretty European to my core.
That's interesting. You said patriotic, but then you say European. So can you go into that a bit more? Because in the UK, we've had this, I don't want to sort of tread over old ground, but they're often held in counterpoint to one another. Yeah,
and I think that's a bit of I think there's a lot of nuance that's been lost from discussion around Brexit. So a good example is one of the AI companies I work with. The founder chose to actually locate the company in London rather than Silicon Valley because it was going to be easier to recruit the people he wanted into the company. Right. So we talk about the UK, being a much more, people caricature it as being more closed post Brexit. But actually, there's been some great research done by John Paul Murdoch at the Financial Times that I think sort of shows that's actually not necessarily true in all domains. And I haven't heard that as much as you might think from some of these leading edge technology companies. And so I think there's this kind of, we want to make everything black and white, but actually there are ways in which I think that, a suitably ambitious progressive government that really wanted to embrace Brexit and make it work could do really interesting things with it. And so I'm not like reflexive, even though I voted Remain, I'm not reflexively negative about Brexit and sort of, it's just, these people who just basically sit there complaining about it all day long on Twitter, like five and years on, 2016, right? So like 7 years on from it, there's a sort of, I don't know, it's become a sort of a tribal identity rather than a sort of first principles assessment of what we should actually do as the UK to sort of make the UK the best possible place to live.
Yeah, David Deutsch, who is one of these hugely influential figures in Silicon Valley, British man, he's based, I think, in Oxford at the moment. And he advocated leave. And, I don't agree with his arguments. I certainly don't think it was wise to leave the single market in the way that we have done. But this idea that everybody who voted leave is thick and stupid, and David Deutsch is literally one of the smartest human beings who's ever lived. And like you say, there are opportunities, particularly with goal-oriented public policy, with new technologies that you probably could do interesting things with in a way that you probably can't, or it's harder to do inside the European Union. But going back to that point about patriotism, so you're patriotic towards the UK or to Europe, or both? How's it work?
Both, yeah. I mean, I guess like the reason I think George Orwell had a lovely sort of take on nationalism versus patriotism. I think he said something like, nationalism is kind of the assertion of your values on other people and pushing your country's values on other people, whereas patriotism is just sort of saying, it's kind of defending your values and just saying like, these are things that are important to me and we want to preserve some of these things. And I feel, that, NHS is the kind of classic example. It's just something that I feel very grateful for. And I feel patriotic about wanting it to continue and to thrive. And, if we're going to apply AI in the NHS, I want it to be done in an incredibly thoughtful way that expands what we've got today rather than in any way undermines it.
So where did you live in China and the US? You said you were there a few years ago?
Yeah. So I moved to China when I was 18 in 2000 to study Mandarin, and then went to university, studied a kind of engineering and machine learning, and then went back to China in 2005 again to study Mandarin. And then I moved to the US, Silicon Valley in 2006. And so I guess I think I was drawn to both places because they're where a lot was changing very rapidly in the world. And it was, I think, somewhere where the pace of change was very exhilarating. But I really feel, I think, the most at home in Europe in terms of kind of the values. I think, and I'd love to see Europe's technology industry and Europe's governments really kind of rise to the moment that is coming in with all this exponential technological change.
Final question, because it goes back to the thing you've mentioned. You wrote this essay about AI nationalism. There's a great talk on YouTube, by the way, once people have finished watching this and maybe watched another Novara Media video. you do a great talk on AI nationalism. It's from a few years ago, and you quote a great book, AI Superpowers, and it's the hypothesis of that. I think is a really strong one. One of the best books I've read in a while. A few years ago, I think PricewaterhouseCoopers say that between 2015 and 2035, $15-16 trillion will be added to the global economy by AI. More or less something like that. And about 70% of that goes to basically the US and China. So all of the gains of this new technology basically are concentrated in these two AI superpowers. Imagine the steam engine, but rather than just Britain benefiting initially, like we get with, the steam revolution, the industrial revolution, and then colonialism, AI basically redounds to the benefit of Beijing and Washington, or Washington/California. Can you go into this hypothesis? Because it sounds to me, on the one hand, you just said a moment ago, you're patriotic to Europe, yet this idea of AI nationalism seems to indicate that Europe isn't really at the races. And actually, on the present path, the two places that will benefit from this are China and the US.
So I think that Europe in general, setting aside the UK, is not very significant, unfortunately, within AI right now. If you look at where the most important kind of concentrations of sort of talent and power are within AI and capabilities, it's actually really cities that matter. And it's Toronto, San Francisco, London, and Beijing. And London is very much on the map.
So London matters more than New York?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, so Demis Hassabis, who arguably kicked off the race we've currently got going on with the founding of DeepMind, and is an absolutely, exceptionally talented person, is now running all of Google's efforts globally from London. The vast majority of the sort of best AI researchers within Google are based in London at DeepMind's office. And so London is incredibly important. It's not just London, not just DeepMind. We also have other organizations of a sort of similar, research stature to DeepMind. So I think that we should not rule the UK out. And actually, I think it's a real opportunity for Europe, the UK to play a leadership role within Europe by kind of bringing some of those assets to the table when Europe wants to do stuff in AI regulation. But to go back to your question about kind of this race between different countries, I think it's incredibly nuanced and complicated because there are basically three different levels you need to think about it at. The first is economic. So, a country that has incredibly sophisticated AI companies will probably benefit more economically from it than those that don't. And that's the kind of takers or makers, or the sort of steam analogy you gave. The second, the second is basically military. And so AI will definitely be used by militaries to achieve decisive advantage. And so in that area, again, like a state is incentivized to build out the capacity to, have autonomous, and even in the Ukraine conflict, you actually see the use of machine learning to actually, provide a decisive edge in certain ways. And the third is this existential thing of like, if we build something smarter and more capable than us that isn't aligned with our goals, it could wipe us all out. And if you look at the three different levels, you've got and you think about the US and China in the way that Kai-Fu Lee kind of presented that race. The US and China clearly are locked into a battle to compete economically. They're certainly locked in a battle to compete militarily, like look at hypersonic missiles or something like that. But this final level, which is like, are they locked in a battle to kind of, ensure that the human species thrives? I think they are actually, they should be on the same page about that, right? So you've got this really challenging problem where you've got two levels of competition and one level where you desperately need cooperation. And that's why I think that like the really missing piece right now here is kind of international leadership around coordination, around how we approach these most powerful AI systems that could become super intelligent.
That's so interesting around AGI. And I can see the argument for cooperation as you would hope for, say, around climate change. But I suppose pulling it back a bit, so going back to the narrow AI things that you spoke about a while back, clearly AI is going to be massively disruptive in terms of economics. And I suppose if you look at the last 20, 25 years and Silicon Valley really capturing so much value across the West, I'm from Bournemouth. If you walk down the high street in Bournemouth, loads of businesses have shut down because that value has been captured by a company headquartered in California, right? And that is an incredible concentration of political, economic, and cultural power. And the argument is the same thing will happen with AI, with more businesses to a far greater extent. And the concern is that basically the world will be divided into two economic spheres, US, China-centric, and the rest of the world will, broadly speaking, just be their satellites. So we don't need to be talking about an AGI and, great power confrontation will lead to somebody potentially creating Skynet because they're seeking military superiority, although that's an interesting debate. But we could be returning to a bipolar world similar to the Cold War, but in many ways far more extensive. Or do you think that I'm sort of being a bit sort of hyperbolic here? Because you have, so quickly to go back, Kai-Fu Lee talks about AI superpowers. Why would it be China and the US that are the AI superpowers? They have the largest populations, ergo the largest amounts of data, and they have the greatest amount of computational power. You might think that, the EU might be a third pole, but it's not really working out hitherto. So geopolitically, the geopolitics of AI, you can see a world, can't you, where there's a great deal of sort of economic dependence, basically a kind of colonialism.
So I think in the AI nationalism essay, I gave an example of a kind of that sort of AI colonialism with a company called CloudWalk from China that was selling certain technologies to, I think it was Zimbabwe. But I actually don't really view it as much from a kind of how it affects individual citizens at a international level, more national level. I think the kind of haves and have-nots within technology are already playing out on a national level. If you look at the deprivation in the Bay Area, right, and you compare the sort of the lot of some of the people, on the streets in the Tenderloin compared to some of the people running these AI companies, you've got far more the Gini coefficient in some ways in sort of some US cities or across US states it may be more extreme than it is between certain nations, and I think that's more concerning, the lot of the average person on Bournemouth versus the lot of the average person in London than it is to me of kind of these sort of country versus country comparisons. And so I think actually the really challenging political problem is actually how you kind of how you kind of raise the floor more broadly in a world in which there are further and further returns to capital.
I think we'll end it there. Ian, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.